I'm Mike Pears, and this is the Life Theological IBTS podcast. And in it, we are privileged to meet and explore the lives of theologians and find out what makes them tick. And today, I'm very privileged to be joined by Reverend Professor Reggie Williams, and we're going to be asking Reggie about some of his life and work. Reggie is a Professor of Christian Ethics at McCormack Theological Seminary, where you've been since 2012, and your doctorate, I believe, was at from Fuller Theological Seminary. So a very warm welcome to you, Reggie, for this podcast. We're delighted to have you.
Thank you.
And I'd like to begin by exploring together some of your earlier years and how those were formative in your current life. I believe you come from northern or mid-California. Can you say a bit about what that was like?
Yeah, for people who are from California, the extreme northern part of the state doesn't really exist. Well, I shouldn't say it doesn't really exist. We just say Northern California as anything that's below, or that's around Sacramento. Sacramento and San Francisco. So without all of that blah, 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 stuff for people who are not from the States. I'm from California. Born and raised. I live in Chicago now. I lived out of the States for a short time as a basketball player in Australia, and now for a short time on my sabbatical in Paris. Right. So, but that's me.
Yeah. And you're still playing basketball?
No, my knees won't let me. No, I'm a cyclist now.
Join the gang. I'm
yeah.
Also a cyclist. Yeah, so that's good. So, Reggie, I think you have some pretty significant influences in your early life, which has been fairly formative in terms of what you're doing now. Could you just say something about your experiences in elementary school?
Sure. So, in California, there are parts of the state where there are more black people than others. And when I was in elementary school, Mom and Dad had us living in a part of the state, or at least in a town where there just weren't many black people. I wouldn't do that to my kids today, because I think it's better to have a sense of who you are, to know who you are, and to live around in communities that are able to help you with that, to help you understand that. But I lived in a small town in a suburb of the Bay Area, California Bay Area, where there weren't many black people. I went to a primarily white elementary school. And in that elementary school, while I was attending there, we were also attending a non-denominational church in Oakland, California. And I would hear at age 8 and 9 in Sunday school, forgive, turn to the cheek, stuff from the Sermon on the Mount especially. I completely remember Pastor Cook talking about the Sermon on the Mount and turn the cheek. Well, as the only black kid in the school, I was also facing racism. Students who would come to school, kids who would come to school, really repeating what their parents would say. Kids didn't know those awful words just by themselves. So I would hear these awful things, specifically from 2 or 3 boys who were bullying me. That's what was happening. It was racial bullying from elementary school from these kids. And I'm turning the other cheek. I'm forgiving 7 times 7. I'm doing what Pastor Cook is saying. And they made up a reason to physically harm me after school one day. And though I could have defended myself very well against these boys, I was trying to follow Jesus. It took me until my adult years to forgive myself for not physically defending myself against these kids. But I did that while trying to be a Christian. So that was in the 3rd grade, which was, for me, age, I want to say 8. And in the following year, in the 4th grade, someone introduced me, a teacher introduced me to Martin Luther King Jr. And I took a book from the library, which I still have today. I never returned it.
It's going to be a large fine on that one.
A large fine. I'm not giving it back. I don't know what. I probably owe the school a whole lot of money. But I borrowed that book, and it was hugely influential for me, starting at age 9. Martin Luther King Jr. was a tremendously important person in my life.
I'm hearing here, Reggie, a kind of remarkable sense of Christianity as a lived faith for you, which is possibly quite unusual for a 8-9-year-old.
Right.
The sense that you need to live out your faith, and there's a theme of through Turn the Other Cheek, some kind of dealing with power and resistance, which I think kind of forms your pathway
Right.
in later life. Is that looking back? What do you think about that 9-year-old? You said that you may have done something different, but you were clearly grappling with the lived experience of faith in that very difficult situation.
Yeah, to get into the mind of that child that I was would be a really interesting thing. I don't know why, but I was already there at age 8, trying to take seriously what it means to live what I said I believe.
Yep.
Just very sincere about it. I was standing in the podium at the school where I teach now, McCormick Theological Seminary, delivering our annual Martin Luther King Jr. lecture as a brand new faculty member when it occurred to me. I'd been on this trajectory my entire life. Today I'm a professor of Christian ethics, which is finding the sources and taking seriously the meaning of questions like what shall we do and how shall we live. That's what I do as an ethicist. Well, I was trying to sort through that as an 8-year-old, and I couldn't tell you why.
So that experience as a boy on the receiving end of violence and racism, it's been deeply formative, really, it's set a trajectory for your life.
It did.
In so many ways.
It did.
You've said a little bit about growing up then through elementary school and high school, and there have been some transformative times as you grew up. Can you say a bit about those and how they affected your later journey?
Well, so the elementary school experience, there was something sincere about having a faith experience too when I was a child. And then turning back towards the faith. So I went through, broken family type stuff, which was an unfortunate thing in my parents' lives and their relationship. We had stopped going to church for a while, and I liked the sense of stability that I had when I was a kid with something related to my faith and a faith experience. So when I was in high school, when I was a teenager, later teen, in my 17s, when I was 17 years old, I turned back to faith. I started looking for a church again and found a man who was kind of a mentor for me. He was also a basketball player. I was a basketball player. At 17, he was 28 years old. He seemed so old to me then. But he'd been a basketball player and kind of took me under his wing as a mentor, and he was a Baptist minister. His family ran a church in what is Stockton, California today. And I just started attending church with him. So I was back in a church congregation, and I was under the mentorship of this Black Baptist minister. And I ended up going to the school that he went to, a small junior college in San Francisco, California. Actually in a suburb of San Francisco called San Bruno.
And through that, you talked about picking up Martin Luther King's book at an early age. Was that when you were around 9 still that you picked that up? That's pretty early age to be kind of reading Martin Luther King. But
right.
Presumably there have been some kind of quite significant thinking in your life,
right,
as a result of getting into that book.
Right. That's true. Yeah. That's true.
So
I read it through then. Probably read it a couple of times and read a lot of content related to Martin Luther King Jr. as a child, and every year around the time of his birthday, there was a radio program that would come on in California, in the Bay Area, on a radio station called KBLX. 102.7 KBLX.
It is deeply in there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
It was 102.7 or 102.9. Yeah. KBLX would replay the story of King, and I was riveted riveted. I still feel that. I mean, since it was my childhood, just listening to and learning everything that I could about King.
So he has been a mentor for you.
Oh, yeah.
In so many ways.
Oh yeah, I would say that I am clearly a Christian ethicist within the tradition of King, and King sits in the tradition of people like Harriet Tubman. I mean, there is a black abolitionist tradition, the black social gospel tradition that King is one of the more popular representatives of. But he's not the inventor. He certainly is not the single person within that tradition. He's one of the children of that tradition.
So when did you become more conscious that you were living into a tradition here? I mean, clearly King himself was on your radar as a 9-year-old. You're growing into that. When did that kind of transition into a deeper sense that you had a tradition here that you were living into? Was that a particular kind of, was that part of what linked you to an academic tradition, Reggie, or were there some other things going on at that point?
So the fact that I was in a tradition wasn't something that became clear to me until I was in my career. There were figures who were important to me. Of course, King is important. And then there were other people when I was in high school, Harriet Tubman was important to me. I did an essay in high school at some point on Harriet Tubman, and she became a real inspiration. When I was writing my dissertation, I also was teaching at a local school, and teaching this. I also taught about Ida B. Wells Barnett, another figure who was hugely important for me. What these people offered for me, these giants of the faith for me, what they offered was a counter narrative to the Christianity that would stand in opposition to King, that would stand in opposition to things that I felt were important, who didn't think that things like justice were Christian, which was so weird for me. There were Christianities that would make it a challenge to recognize lived experience as within the scope of moral responsibility for Christians. They're talking about things like doctrine, stand alone apart from daily life, which is weird to me, which was weird to me. So it was really, it was when I got into my career as an ethicist that I started paying closer attention to things like traditions of Christianity, to learn that I'm actually within one.
So and part of that tradition that you were following was this deep sense of an embodied ethic, a living out, which sounds like it'd been ingrained through your growing years. Yeah.
So I studied theology as an undergrad in a Christian college, a small Christian college. And ironically, I entered that school from a junior college. I don't know if your listeners know, but in the United States you have the possibility of a 2-year college degree. A lot of people go straight to a 4-year college. I went first to a 2-year college and then transferred from there to a 4-year college, but it took me 3 years. I came in as an athlete and then had another year after my basketball eligibility was up. I had another year left to complete my degree. I took 3 years at that 4-year school after transferring with 2 years. So 5 years altogether. And it's a lot of math. Probably, in this theology podcast.
And a lot of basketball as well, maybe.
It was a lot of basketball. So I started off when I transferred to the 4-year school as a French language major. I didn't come in as a theology major, but I changed from French to theology, realizing that that's really what I wanted to do anyway.
Did you have a sense of becoming a theologian at any point, Reggie? There's this growing interest in theology and living things out, but was there a kind of moment where you thought, I'm a theologian here?
Not until I was actually in my career that I thought about it in that way, because the pursuit for me was never to become a scholar even, or become a theologian, the pursuit for me was about understanding, making sense of being a Christian.
What were you having to deal with in terms of racism at that stage? Did you, presumably there were still some experiences that you were having to, in the education system, that you were having to deal with? What was happening there?
Even if a person doesn't face it in an overt sense, someone saying things or doing things, it's often the case that we inhabit the spaces where we find ourselves accommodating racism. Some of the ways that that shows up are receiving the way that the academy is structured, with whites-only syllabi, whites-only curriculums, whites-only professorships, whites-only this and that and everything, and having that make sense, that the faith that we are handed comes to us from elite white minds, and that is the structure of a thinking world. That is how the world is created, by elite white minds who hand reality to us. And for people of color, women who have the world handed to them that's thought up by elite white minds, there's a way of accommodating that. You just accommodate it. So when you do that, you internalize some things. For example, when I entered the my PhD program, it was clear for me, and a lot of others as well that I find in the classroom, my own students, that they're diversifying. The reason why I got in is because I'm a person of color, not on merit. Everybody else gets in on merit, but I got in because, of race. So they're doing me a favor. And the same thing happens for undergrads. At the collegiate level, students, my daughter goes to an elite school in the States, in New Haven. Students typically assume that that person of color on campus is there because of affirmative action, that they are taking the place of an otherwise qualified candidate because the institution is diversifying. That's what higher ed systems offer to a world when they don't challenge the way that the whole elite white mind imagined world is working and handing itself to the world. That's all thought up. It's an imagination. So one does not need to hear people say something derogatory directly to them. All you need to do is simply exist in the academy, or take the world as it comes to you.
So some of your work, Reggie, I think has been around the invisibility of whiteness, which is would you say that that's a way of describing what you've just talked about?
Right.
This is the kind of embedded and the habits and practices that are taken for granted.
Yes.
Generally unquestioned, but dominate our lives and form our assumptions and our worldviews.
Yes.
The invisibility of whiteness. And I think, so we have some students here who are researching around that area. And it's,
right. It is, to use a couple of words, ubiquitous and normal. It comes to us after centuries of formation. Is the way that the world is structured from a set of giants who've helped us to think ourselves, know ourselves, and simply be together. It is how we understand what it means to be human. The challenge for us, and I was just talking to one of your PhD students here, about this when he's thinking about what he's going to be doing for his dissertation. Many people think that activism is done in the streets. You know, you do your community organizing to help people vote, to get people jobs and to help them stay in their jobs, to get wages up, you know, pass laws and so forth. That kind of that's activism, and it absolutely is. People think that the scholar doesn't do activism, that the person who sits behind a desk is not an activist. And I'd like to point out how wrong that is.
Well, I would like for us to explore that, Reggie, through some of the works that you've done, notably two. The outstanding one, Bonhoeffer's Black Jesus, Harlem Renaissance Theology, and An Ethic of Resistance.
Right.
I want to come to asking you about what kinds of impacts and effects that has in the way that you're describing it now. Why is scholarship so important for change in the world? But before we do that, can I ask you a couple of questions about what do you mean by Bonhoeffer's Black Jesus? First of all, what do you mean by Black Jesus? And what's Bonhoeffer got to do with that?
Yeah.
Just kind of outline that for us so that we know where we're going.
Yeah, you sound like Tina Turner. What's love got to do with it?
Yes.
Yeah. So, funny thing, just a side note, the publisher was insistent on that title. I was initially pushing for Black Bonhoeffer. The publisher liked Bonhoeffer's Black Jesus, and it was catchy in its souls, and I think he's right. I'm glad his title stuck. But the reason for that title is because Bonhoeffer is trained in a German theological academy, the best and the brightest that are capable in the theological world of his day. And the way information, especially theological information, happens is it flows from Europe, in this context, from Germany out to the rest of the world. Might say, following his trajectory, which he went from the German Academy to New York and back, that the hermeneutical flow, the epistemological flow of theology flows from Germany to the United States. In his case, it was a bit reversed. Comes from Harlem back to Germany. It's not that he wasn't a theologian before he went over there. It's that he was primarily an academic theologian before he went over there. He comes over to Harlem and finds himself grounded in his faith, comes back Christian. Something happened to him.
Almost a conversion for Bonhoeffer,
Yeah.
I think, in his own words.
Something happened for him there. What he did was brought back with him a Jesus who mattered for him in a pietist way. I mean, it becomes confessional. It grounds him in something that matters to him. Whereas prior to that, he was an academic theologian primarily, a very proud and fairly arrogant one too, as a young man.
Yes. So there's something. There's one of the things that comes out of that, I think, through your work, is this idea of an ethic of resistance.
Mm-hmm.
So again, it's coming back, isn't it, to this theme that we see about moving from, if you like, the pure academics, and does that ever exist in Christian theology? I maybe not, maybe it does, but wanting to ground it somehow.
Mm-hmm.
So could you say what you mean by what is an ethic of resistance, and how does it flow out of this idea of a notion of a Black Jesus?
There are lots of ways that people talk about resistance. Resistance in a physical sense, resistance maybe in a nonviolent, passive way. Resistance in the way in which we think of the world. So the world we were just talking about the invisibility of whiteness.
Mm-hmm.
This is a world that has centuries of theological, academic, it just has centuries of academic rigor behind it, economic and political rigor behind it as well. It's a world that's been thought into existence. the world that exists behind your eyes, that you know you're in. And I put "know" in square quotes. Okay. That's a world that's been given to us by people we have to read in school to be educated. The work of the academic to imagine another one is academic resistance. To change this imagination with a different imagination, to hand people that. You might say that Bonhoeffer comes from Europe with a Jesus who is Eurocentric. That the theological world, the world of salvation, moves from Israel as the center of the Christian world to Germany, to Europe as the center of the Christian world. Bonhoeffer comes over to the United States and enters a black church and has another experience of Christ-centeredness. Here, this is a Christ who was not centered on European risen with all power, but hidden in suffering and shame. This Jesus has one's entire being under the gospel, whereas before he comes to the United States, the Jesus that he encounters, you might say the Christianity that he encounters, is for wealthy people. You know, the church has its engagement with life in limited ways. People don't hesitate to baptize their kids, you know, First Communion and so forth, and that kind of thing there. But it's a part of elite German culture. What does it say at a time, what does it say to a society at a time when people are eating bread made with sawdust and flour after World War I, to immense poverty and shame? What does the gospel say about that? It's a church for cultured elite. He comes to the United States and he meets a people who know the church primarily because of their connection to Christ and suffering. Jesus is a lawyer to in the courtroom. He's a doctor in the sick room, a mother to the motherless, a father to the fatherless. You know, he is my all in all. In the midst of suffering, on the cross, God was with Jesus, and because God was with Jesus on the cross, he's with us in our suffering and will bring us to Sunday.
So the work of theology that you're describing there, Reggie, it isn't as if theology is in the back room and then the ethic of resistance happens as a result of that. It's not an applied way, but the work of theology itself is the resistance. It's the challenging of this Eurocentric worldview, the privileged worldview. So it's the theological work itself is engaging with and challenging, resisting the hegemony that's been in place for so many decades.
Yes.
Centuries.
And one might even say, to use that language, that the theology is the embodied, lived encounter. It's not the orthodoxy or the doctrine that one reads and then applies to life. It comes out of life. It is embedded within the lived knowledge that God is with us. So then the academician comes along then and makes sense of this, writing it in relationship to the Protestant Reformation. Mm-hmm. What is the roots of this lived, embodied encounter with God as we think through other written doctrines? Mm-hmm. You know, this comes out of the moment. It comes out of this experience of the body matters.
How do we deal with violence in that context? Reggie, you were talking a little bit earlier about your 9-year-old, 8-year-old school days, and you know, the teaching at the time to turn the other cheek. You tried to do that. What would you say to your younger self in relation to defence? This is a particularly relevant question at the moment, obviously with the war in Ukraine going on.
Yeah, that's a good one. That's a good question. I would say that many people interpret nonviolence only at the moment when the choice is being made to defend myself or not to defend myself. That it's important to recognize that that moment of decision is not the only time to think about nonviolence. That nonviolence is a way of living prior to the encounter with the potential for response. And that I would have most definitely told myself that I did not need to stand there and take that from those three boys, when prior to that encounter, I am making overtures towards them and adults and others for a peaceful resolution to what they believe they understand about the world. But it's not on me. It's not my responsibility to have them think differently about me. One of the all of that is violence. To try and turn those disciples of racism away from their convictions wasn't my responsibility. I'm saying this in terms of like a response to that young man, that I once was, because I felt like I was the evangelist there, and for whatever reason, people of color are always tasked with being the better Christians.
Yes, you were engaging with the community through King and through Bonhoeffer, who were deeply immersed in themselves in this question of violence.
Yes.
And non-violence, and you presumably, from what you said, Reggie, finding yourself as part of a tradition of that was wrestling with exactly those kinds of issues. They were formative in your thinking about issues of violence.
Yes, they were. They were. I would say most definitely that it was wrong that child that I was left alone to deal with that. By even saying to myself that what I would tell that child is already an intervention that wasn't there for me. It was a big deal that this young boy needed help. That was a failure of adults, a failure of Christianity. Everybody failed that young man. The first thing we would need to recognize is that resistance, nonviolent resistance, is a body of Christ thing. That's a communal thing. The only reason why that worked in the civil rights movement was because whole communities were doing it. If you're not doing that with a community, it's the difference between what Audre Lorde says, suffering and pain. Pain happens in private. Suffering happens where people can see it and it has the opportunity to make a change for the good. That young man was in pain, hidden, and it did nothing to me, it didn't really do much for me or for the community. I was just suffering in silence and hidden. And people knew about it though.
Reggie, you've moved on from that book, Bonhoeffer's Black Jesus, and you're investigating at the moment theological anthropology. What's the journey there? So we've touched, I think, quite briefly probably on these areas. People can read the book.
Yeah.
So where are you going with that? So with these questions of developing your life, become a professor. What's your journey at the moment, and what is theological anthropology, and how is that expressive of the sorts of things you've been talking about?
The work that I did about Dietrich Bonhoeffer in Harlem. Now, I spent that time talking about Bonhoeffer coming from a Eurocentric world with a Eurocentric Christ, and encountering this community that sees Christ-centered in a different way. That does not mean that Bonhoeffer did not still stay Eurocentric. There were some things that Bonhoeffer encountered that changed some stuff for him, tethered him to his faith in a serious way. But there are a lot of things he still had wrong. One might say that I would like to help Christians recognize where the errors were. 'Cause, right, it's diagnosis. Proper diagnosis leads to good treatment for what we are dealing with today, in a broad sense, in a world, where we still struggle to recalibrate what it means to be human in the wake of some of the world's most harmful and horrendous moments.
Can you indicate what are one or two of those critical areas that you would, and how do they have practical impacts in our lives today?
Well, when I talk about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, I help to center us on a conversation that everyone will recognize, at least most everyone recognizes as awful: the Holocaust. But in the United States, I really don't need to go to Europe. We can talk about, and we must talk about, the transatlantic slave trade. People say, well, that was so long ago. The transatlantic slave trade was, and slavery in the United States, physically, you might say, or some even, can argue about that, but put it this way: the Civil War ended in 1865. The ideology that animated the need to go to war did not. And we are still in the wake of that moment, in the wake of that history. The wake is the water behind a boat as it moves along. Wake is the ritual after a death before a funeral. It's the terrain after a terrible catastrophe, the wake. We are in the wake of the slave trade, in which we have not yet recalibrated the meaning of human life in this world. So when we say human flourishing, the meaning of human life together, how we fulfill the purpose and the meaning of human life. When we ask questions, how shall we live? What shall we do? We're asking these questions about the purpose of human life in relationship to God. Well, if we are still struggling with what it means to be human, our answers to that question are just burdened with problems. Even on our best day, even in our most sincere moments, we have to interrogate what we mean by human.
And that is part of the value of academic research that's rooted in some of those historical and lived experiences.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, the most sincere Christians will say things like, the purpose of human life and human flourishing. We build our guilds on concepts like that. But we are working with presumptions. So to think through the meaning of human life together is to get at unpacking and recalibrating some of the most fundamental terms that guide our understanding of the faith and of Christian ethics.
Well, Reggie, I think that's an excellent statement to finish this podcast on, and there's been it's been a rich conversation, a lot to think about. I suggest people go away and dig into your books and the books of others we've referenced in this podcast. But it's been a pleasure and a privilege to talk to you, Professor Reggie Williams. Thank you very much for your participation today.
Glad to be here.